Hi there, this is the second part for the 14th lecture on Life and Destiny stage presented by Sumio Umekawa with my old picture. This is when my daughter got into the elementary school. The second part, entitled as Reigaku and Reigakkai, we will study the export of Reigaku movement in Japan to China. We start from the boom of studying in Japan, which will be followed by the shift of the base from Kobe to Shanghai. Finally, we will see the Chinese conflict concerning about Reigaku between a group of new youth and that of Reigaku magazines. In the ending phase of the last empire, Qing, after having encountered with the West and noticed their power, Chinese let many youths to go abroad for study. It was, of course, to catch up and overtake the West. Therefore, at first, they sent students to the Western countries like America and Britain, as well as Russia. However, probably due to the differences in language as well as food, many Chinese students failed to stay studying abroad. For Chinese at that time, Japan, which had already started modernized and westernized, seemed to be a very good model. Therefore, they started to send students to Japan so that they could have hint how Japanese successfully modernized the people. Then, they found that sending students to Japan was more successful than sending them to the Western countries or Russia. For students, studying in Japan should have been much more comfortable than doing in other Western countries because of the closeness in language and food. Although Chinese and Japanese are very different in pronunciation as well as grammars, but Japanese had adopted Chinese characters. Also, by the early Showa, educated Japanese were very fluent to read Chinese classics. Therefore, even if Chinese students couldn't speak Japanese well, still they could communicate with Japanese through written characters. Therefore, the boom of studying in Japan happened. For instance, Chen Duxiu and Lu Xun, the father of the modern Chinese literature, had studied in Japan. Indeed, Sendai is very famous amongst Chinese even today because Lu Xun studied there. So, 800,000 students a year came to Japan for study at its peak. It is said China at that time received a great influence from students studied in Japan. For instance, May 4th movement can be counted as one. This movement was, at first, the movement to enlighten common people through literature. Therefore, it was a movement led by students, or at least young intellectuals, like Tiananmen incident. However, it gradually shifted to more political movement to break through superstitions, so to make China more modernized nation. As the movement shifted to more political claim, the severeness or harshness of the movement also increased, again, just like in the case of Tiananmen. And people studying abroad, especially in Japan, were the kind of leaders of this movement. Lu Xun was one of them. Some Chinese scholars propose without those who studied in Japan at that period, we wouldn't have modern China. So the magnitude of influence from students studied in Japan was that much. Indeed, some say modern Chinese as a language was also influenced by those students studied in Japan. Reimportation of words created in Japan was actually quite popular. Japanese, once they encountered a new Western word, created new Japanese by combining Chinese characters in addition to putting them phonetically into katakana. For instance, Japanese couldn't find an appropriate Japanese translation for the word mind. Therefore, they put sei and shin. Both of them are characters related with the idea of chi and sometimes mind to create the new word seishin. Of course, this new word created by Japanese through combining Chinese characters were re-imported to China, and therefore modern Chinese has a word Qingsheng. In accordance to a calculation by some scholars, a half of Chinese language, around 2000, were re-imported words from Japan during the boom of studying in Japan. In addition to modernization and a new vocabulary, Reigaku was another thing which greatly influenced China during this period. A student named Bao Fanzhou was studying in Japan. He was a student studying hypnosis. And of course, he was interested in Reigaku movement happening and proceeding on time. And so he founded Chinese Research Institute on Mind in Kobe, where he studied, so that he could enlighten Chinese in the continent through publishing and sending magazines about Reigaku. Information sent by Bao was greatly welcomed by Chinese, especially those with high status. For instance, there were following people who subscribed Bao's magazine. Liu Feigui, who was the general manager of the biggest bookstore as well as a publisher in China, Zhonghua Shudian. Yu Fu, who was one of the founders of another bookstore and publisher, Wenming Shuju. These two, in addition to others with high social status, founded Shandetan Lingshui Hui in Shanghai as the base of Reigaku or Lingshui in mainland China. Here, Japanese Reigaku movement introduced by Bao Fangzhou was landed on China. Also, with the emergence of this particular institute, Lingshui, the Chinese version of Reigaku, started to spread more widely in China. But why Chinese with high social status were interested in Reigaku to explain something unexplainable? At that time, China was under the May 4th movement, and many traditions were about to be abandoned because these were regarded as superstitious. Amongst those things about to be abandoned, there were many things which had supported Chinese mind or spirits. For instance, religious Taoism and things around Taoism were attacked as superstitious. I introduced to you the new Chinese base for Reigaku or Lingshui founded in Shanghai as Shandetan Lingshui Hui. Here, Shandetan indicate Shande group of Fuqi, the Chinese spiritual automatism. It further indicates members of Chinese Lingshui Hui were members of Fuqi group. This Fuqi group actually included the head of China Bank at that time. As a tradition, many important people like the head of the hugest bank had decided important things, usually through Fuqi spiritual automatism. Again, traditionally, Fuqi was regarded as things around Taoism. Of course, Fuqi was listed as a top to be abandoned under May 4th movement. But for those important people, the ban of Fuqi was a matter of life and death. Without Fuqi, they couldn't run the companies or bank. They were desperate to protect Fuqi and some other traditions for themselves. The leaders of May 1st movements were young intelligents who had studied abroad, as I said. Many of them were the literati at the same time. They contributed their poems, stories, or essays onto a magazine called New Youth, created by Chen Dushu. For instance, Lu Xun's famous novel, The Story of Aju or Argue, and Madman's Diary were distributed to this particular magazine. So they were the intelligence, literary men, and leaders to modernize China. Those leaders of May 1st movement, therefore, understood the need to catch up with the West. They noticed that Chinese had more superstitions than Westerners. They thought Those superstitions which could not be explained logically or scientifically were the reason China was looked down by the West. Therefore, they claimed to break through superstitions. Of course, for them, Lingxue Congshu, the magazine published by the Shanghai base for Leigaku or Lingxue, was the enemy who went against their way. As both of them used magazines to enlighten the common people, May First leaders severely criticized Lingxue Congshu magazine as well as people involved in it on their own magazine, New Youth. Gradually, the composition of New Youth versus Lingxue Congshu became clear. This composition can be paraphrased as a conflict between modern scientific West versus old-fashioned superstitious China. Although there were much more Chinese than May First leaders would have thought who found some old-fashioned superstitious traditions great value. Both of them regarded things should be explainable logically and scientifically. However, they couldn't share if one thing could be scientifically explainable. So let's take in Fuqi as an example. Fuqi, from New Youth or May First leaders' point of view, was as follows. A stick used in Fuqi, on which divine would allegedly come down, was actually moved by a holder through changeable mind, which was synonymous with subconscious mind. Therefore, for New Youth or May First leaders, Fuqi was not a theme for scientific study. Moreover, they criticized Leigaku or Lingxue's attitude of scientific research onto something unexplainable. It was for them nonsense. On the other hand, Fuqi from Lingxue point of view was explainable from scientific psychology if the stick was moved through the changeable mind. For them, the connection with the changeable mind or subconscious mind perfectly shows that Fuqi was not a superstition. They tried to protect unexplainable tradition through science. And one of the most convenient science for them was hypnosis and psychology. Both of them deal with something invisible, like human mind. The conflict between May First leaders and Lingxue continued, but some other Chinese started to join in Leigaku or Lingxue part. Therefore, two magazines linked with Leigaku or Lingxue started to be published. One is called Xinling Wenhua, while the other one is called Yangshan Bangyue Gan. The former attempted to explain the existence of spirit, poltergeist, Fuqi, and etc. scientifically. Therefore, the former magazine very often used Western and Japanese academic articles in hypnosis and psychology. Meanwhile, the latter attempted to show how mental and physical techniques in Taoism are explainable scientifically. So the latter very often explained Taoist classics or Taoist tradition in modern, logical, scientific ways. So this is the end of the second part for the 14th lecture. See you again in the third, final part again.